Before dawn broke over Saipan, the jungle was alive with the low hum of engines. The sound rolled over the hills like distant thunder, mechanical and deliberate. Marines crouched in their positions, scanning the darkness. Some thought it was artillery moving, others knew better. What they heard were tanks, but not the heavy monsters of Europe. These were small, fast, and unlike anything most Marines had seen before. As the first outlines appeared through the haze, someone whispered, "Hargo tanks." Another Marine checked the belt on his .50 caliber gun and muttered, "Let's see if this thing can do the job." None of them could have predicted what would happen next. To understand that moment, we have to step back a few years, to a time when those same tanks were symbols of pride. In the 1930s, Japan was rapidly expanding its military capabilities. Its armies had marched across China with confidence, often facing opponents without significant armored resistance. The Type 95 Hargo, a light tank developed by Mitsubishi, had been one of the backbones of these campaigns. In China, it seemed unstoppable. Against infantry and light fortifications, it performed beyond expectations. The crews who drove it came to believe it was not just a tool of war but a masterpiece of engineering, the perfect machine for the battlefields of Asia. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. When the design began in 1933, Japanese engineers were solving a clear problem. The Army's existing tanks were too slow. The older Type 89 model moved at little more than walking speed, which made it useless for fast-moving warfare. Japan's military planners wanted something that could move quickly across open terrain, accompany trucks and motorized infantry, and climb steep, uneven ground. They didn't need a heavily armored giant, they needed a nimble hunter. The Hargo was their answer. By the standards of the early 1930s, the Hargo was an impressive achievement. It was compact, weighing just over 7 tons, powered by a 6-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine that could push it to nearly 45 kilometers per hour on roads. The use of diesel fuel was both practical and strategic. It was less flammable than gasoline and easier to source within Japan's sphere of influence. Engineers were particularly proud of its unique suspension, a simple yet effective bell crank system that allowed the tank to glide over rough terrain with surprising agility. During field tests in Manchuria, military observers were astonished by how smoothly it moved and how quickly it could turn. For its time, the Hargo seemed years ahead of the competition. The design philosophy behind it was straightforward: build a fast, lightweight tank capable of resisting small arms fire and supporting infantry in the field. Its armor was thin, only about 12 millimeters at its thickest points, but in the mid-1930s, that was enough to deflect rifle bullets and light machine gun fire. Its main weapon, a 37mm cannon, was more than sufficient to deal with older tanks or concrete bunkers. In the jungles and hills of Asia, speed mattered far more than brute strength. The Hargo was perfectly tuned to that environment. Inside, however, life for the crew was far from comfortable. The tank carried 3 men, a driver, a machine gunner, and a commander who also served as gunner and loader. There was no turret basket, no powered traverse. Every turn of the turret came from the commander's own effort. Space was so limited that he often stood the entire time, unable to sit, moving between controls while shouting orders through the noise. Radios were scarce. Most tanks relied on flags or visual signals to coordinate movements. Still, within the Imperial Japanese Army, these were accepted trade-offs. The emphasis was on mobility and simplicity. Maintenance was easy, production costs were low, and the vehicles rarely broke down. The Hargo was not just a weapon, it was a statement of Japan's confidence in its engineering philosophy. That confidence grew with every victory. From the vast plains of northern China to the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, Japanese armored units rolled forward seemingly unstoppable. The Hargo became a familiar sight in the empire's expanding territories. British, Chinese, and Filipino defenders had little that could stop them. The 37mm gun tore through enemy positions, while its twin machine guns swept across trenches and open fields. Each victory reinforced a powerful illusion that the Hargo was not just effective, but invincible. But illusions have a way of fading when the conditions change. The Hargo was built for the battlefields of the 1930s, where tanks faced infantry and light vehicles, not other tanks. When it encountered modern armor and weapons designed in the 1940s, that balance would shift dramatically. And that shift began, not in a Japanese factory, but thousands of miles away, on an island in the middle of the Pacific, where the US Marines were about to rewrite everything Japanese tank crews thought they knew about armored warfare. By the late 1930s, the Type 95 Hargo had become the pride of Japan's armored forces. In every campaign, it proved swift, reliable, and devastating against unprepared opponents. During operations in China, the tank seemed untouchable. Enemy bullets pinged harmlessly off its hull, and its diesel engine rarely failed. When Japanese troops advanced through muddy roads and narrow mountain passes, the Hago kept pace. Crews began to treat it almost like a living companion, a dependable partner that had carried them through every danger. So when reports came of a clash with the Soviet Union along the Mongolian border in 1939, few in Tokyo doubted the outcome. Japan's officers expected another easy victory. But the battlefield at Khalkhin Gol told a different story. There, the Hago faced something new: Soviet BT series tanks, armed with 45mm guns and clad in thicker armor. For the first time, Japanese crews realized their 37mm shells bounced off enemy hulls, while Soviet rounds tore through theirs with ease. The encounters were short, chaotic, and humbling. Dozens of Hagos were destroyed. The shock should have led to change. Some engineers warned that armor and firepower needed urgent upgrades, but the lessons of Khalkhin Gol were softened by later victories. When the war in the Pacific began in 1941, Japan's tank forces returned to the environment they understood: jungles, plantations, and small islands. Against poorly equipped defenders in Malaya and the Philippines, the Hago once again seemed untouchable. It moved where the enemy thought tanks couldn't go, crossing rivers and pushing through forests. It appeared unstoppable, and the confidence of its crews returned stronger than ever. When the first US tanks appeared in the Philippines, the M3 Stuart light tanks, the Japanese believed they were evenly matched. Both mounted 37mm guns, both were lightly armored. In those early encounters, the outcome often depended on who spotted the other first. Japanese tactics relied on speed and surprise, and in the tight jungle terrain, that was often enough. These successes confirmed what the crews already believed: that their Hago was still a worthy machine. But by 1944, the war had changed. Japan's forces were no longer the hunters, they were the defenders. American industry had shifted into high gear, producing tanks, ships, and planes at a rate no other nation could match. When US Marines landed on Saipan in June 1944, they brought with them hundreds of armored vehicles, among them the M4 Sherman. Compared to the Hago, it was enormous, more than 4 times heavier, with armor thick enough to shrug off anything the Japanese 37mm gun could fire. Its main cannon was a 75mm weapon that could disable a Hago from over a kilometer away. For the Japanese defenders, the difference wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. Saipan wasn't just another island, it was a line in the sand. The island sat within range of Japan's home territory. If the Americans took it, they could bomb Tokyo itself. Every soldier and tank crew on Saipan knew what was at stake. They were determined to fight to the last vehicle, the last position. Among them was Colonel Takashi Goto, commander of the 9th Tank Regiment. His force included over 40 tanks, mostly Hagos, with a handful of slightly larger Type 97 Kaiha mediums. In theory, it was the most powerful armored formation Japan had ever deployed in the Pacific. On paper, it looked impressive. In reality, it faced overwhelming odds. The Marines had heavy tanks, air support, naval artillery, and seemingly endless supplies. The Japanese, cut off from reinforcement, had to rely on courage, coordination, and faith in their machines. As the Americans landed on June 15, 1944, Japanese observers watched from the ridges above the beaches. The sight was staggering: lines of landing craft, waves of troops, and the unmistakable silhouettes of Sherman tanks rolling onto the shore. For 2 days, the Japanese forces prepared a counterattack. The plan was simple and daring: strike before the Americans could fully organize. The infantry would assault the beachhead, and the tanks would follow in a sweeping charge under the cover of darkness. It was a plan that might have worked years earlier against less prepared opponents. But Saipan was different. The Marines had dug in, their machine guns positioned, and their .50 caliber Brownings waiting, weapons the Japanese tankers barely even considered a threat. As night fell on June 16th, Japanese crews checked their equipment one last time. They loaded 37mm shells, refueled their tanks, and inspected every track and bolt. Many had painted good luck charms or family emblems on their hulls, small marks of identity in a sea of identical machines. They believed in their tanks. They trusted their training. What they didn't know was that within a few hours, that trust would be shattered completely, not by artillery or aircraft, but by the deep, rhythmic thunder of machine guns. Shortly after midnight on June 17, 1944, the stillness around Saipens Hills broke. Engines growled to life one after another, forming a chorus of heavy vibrations that rolled through the dark. Colonel Goto's tank regiment began its approach. Dozens of Hargo light tanks and a few heavier Kaiha models crept forward in the pre-dawn haze, their headlights dimmed, their silhouettes barely visible against the terrain. Japanese infantry moved alongside them, clutching rifles, ready to follow the armor into what they hoped would be a decisive counterattack. Inside each Hargo, the air was thick with heat and diesel fumes. The commanders peered through narrow vision slits, whispering orders through metal tubes to their drivers. Radios were rare, so coordination depended on hand signals and flashes of light. For many crews, this was their first battle against American forces on such a scale. Yet they were calm. Their tanks had served faithfully before. The plan was clear: strike fast, surprise the Marines, and push them back toward the beach before sunrise. On the American side, the Marines were exhausted but alert. They had spent the night reinforcing their positions, expecting an attack. Sentries along the perimeter began to hear faint clanking and the steady hum of engines from the north. At first, they assumed it was their own armor repositioning. But the sound grew louder, closer, more rhythmic. Then came the unmistakable squeal of treads grinding over rock. Someone shouted, "Tanks! Incoming!" In seconds, the camp transformed from rest to readiness. Machine gunners ran to their posts, half-tracks pivoted into firing positions, and the crews of Sherman tanks climbed aboard. Along the defensive line, several Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns were mounted and ready. These were powerful weapons, originally designed for use against aircraft and light vehicles. Each fired heavy 12.7mm rounds at almost 900 meters per second. The gunners knew what the weapon could do to trucks, boats, or thin metal sheets. But tanks? That seemed far-fetched. At 3:30 a.m., the Japanese formation emerged from the darkness. 44 tanks rolled forward, the largest armored assault Japan would ever launch in the Pacific. The engines roared in unison as they crested a small ridge, their silhouettes illuminated briefly by flares and tracer rounds. Some of the lead tanks fired as they advanced, their 37mm guns sending bright flashes across the night. Marines crouched low, gripping their weapons, waiting for the right moment to respond. Then, a thunderous chorus erupted from the Marine lines. The .50 caliber Brownings opened fire, their deep, rhythmic bursts echoing across the valley. Tracer rounds streaked through the air, bright red lines cutting across the dark. The first round slammed into the approaching tanks, and to everyone's astonishment, they didn't ricochet. They went straight through. Marine gunners couldn't believe what they were seeing. They expected sparks and dents. Instead, they saw flashes of light bursting out from the far sides of the tanks. The armor of the Hargo, designed to resist rifle and light machine gunfire, was no match for the .50 caliber's armor-piercing ammunition. At distances under 200 meters, the bullets easily penetrated the 12mm plating, entering one side and exiting the other with energy to spare. One gunner, firing from a sandbagged position near the airfield, watched his tracer round stitch across the front of an oncoming tank. The vehicle slowed, then came to a stop. Smoke drifted from the rear engine vents, and a moment later, the hatch popped open as two crewmen climbed out, dazed and disoriented. They tried to retreat toward the trees but were quickly pulled down by defensive fire. A second Marine, operating a half-track with a mounted Browning, fired into the side of another Hargo at less than 150 meters. The rounds tore through the thin armor panels, disabling the engine almost instantly. The tank veered off course and stopped dead, its tread still turning uselessly. Across the line, similar scenes unfolded. The .50 caliber fire swept through the Japanese formation with devastating effect. Tanks that had once felt invincible were suddenly vulnerable to weapons the Japanese never considered a threat. The crews inside were stunned. They had fought in China, in the Philippines, and in countless small battles where small arms fire had merely bounced off their armor. But now, every metallic impact came with a terrifying realization: the bullets were passing through. Some Hargos tried to maneuver behind cover, others pressed forward in desperation. Their 37mm guns barked, but the shells couldn't penetrate the thick frontal armor of the Shermans waiting deeper in the line. As the Japanese tanks closed in, the Shermans began to return fire. The contrast was immense. A 75mm shell from a Sherman could disable a Hargo from over a kilometer away, but here, at close range, it was over in seconds. A single shot could split the light tank's hull or throw its turret completely off alignment. The sky flickered with muzzle flashes and streaking traces. The ground shook with every explosion. But beneath the chaos, one clear fact was emerging. Japan's tanks were outmatched not only by the enemy's heavy armor but even by their machine guns. The Marines had discovered, almost by accident, that their most common defensive weapon could tear through what the Japanese considered armored vehicles. It was a revelation that would reshape their tactics for the rest of the Pacific campaign. As the first wave of Japanese tanks fell silent, the battlefield erupted into chaos. Flames flickered against the night sky, painting the landscape in alternating shades of red and orange. The smell of burning oil and cordite filled the air. The Marines, still behind their sandbag walls, could hardly believe what they were witnessing. An entire armored assault being broken apart not by heavy artillery, but by machine guns mounted on jeeps, half-tracks, and even foxholes. 4 decades after the war, veterans of Saipan would recall that moment as the night when the impossible happened. The M2 Browning, the Mar-Deuce, had already earned a reputation as a versatile tool of destruction, but this was different. It wasn't just suppressing infantry or shooting down aircraft, it was disabling tanks, something no one had seriously expected from a machine gun. Crews reported that the weapon's armor-piercing rounds punched through the Hagio's thin plating as though it were paper, sometimes entering from the front and exiting through the rear engine compartment. When dawn finally arrived, the full scale of the Japanese disaster became visible. Over 40 tanks lay scattered across the field, some overturned, others burned out or half-submerged in craters. Marine engineers later counted dozens of holes punched cleanly through the armor of many vehicles, evidence of the sheer kinetic power of the .50 caliber round. The light tanks that had once seemed fast and unstoppable now looked fragile, almost antique compared to the massive American Shermans lined up along the beach. The defeat at Saipan was more than a tactical failure. It exposed the limits of Japan's pre-war military philosophy. The Type 95 Hago had been designed for speed and maneuverability, ideal for Asia's early conflicts, but on the wide, open battlefields of the Pacific, it was hopelessly outdated. American firepower, mobility, and coordination had evolved far beyond what the Japanese command anticipated. For the first time, many Japanese officers began to understand that bravery and strategy alone could no longer make up for the gap in technology and industry. Meanwhile, among the Marines, the battle became a legend. Word spread quickly through the ranks about how the .50 caliber machine guns had stopped an entire tank regiment. Gunners began to see their weapons in a new light, not just as defensive tools, but as true tank stoppers when used correctly. The weapon's versatility became one of its greatest strengths. Mounted on vehicles, ships, aircraft, and even static positions, it proved effective in every role. Soldiers nicknamed it Mar-Deuce, a blend of affection and respect for its reliability and sheer force. What made the M2 so remarkable was not just its power, but its simplicity. The weapon worked on a short recoil system, meaning that after each shot, the barrel and bolt moved backward together before separating, extracting the spent cartridge, reloading, and firing again. It could sustain rates of fire between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, launching each bullet with incredible velocity. Against light armor, trucks, aircraft, and even fortifications, it was nearly unstoppable. The Americans had stumbled onto something the Japanese had never prepared for, a single, portable weapon that could be mounted almost anywhere and threaten nearly anything. For Japanese tank crews, the psychological impact was immense. Survivors of the Saipan battle later described the helplessness they felt as their trusted vehicles failed them. Many had believed their armor could withstand most small arms fire. When they realized it couldn't, the panic spread quickly. Without effective communication between tanks and infantry, the attack collapsed within minutes. By sunrise, the once proud 9th Tank Regiment was gone, and with it, Japan's hope of repelling the Saipan invasion. The destruction of the Hagos on Saipan sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Army. Reports filtered back to Tokyo, detailing the unexpected effectiveness of the American heavy machine guns. Engineers reviewed the data and concluded that Japan's light tank designs had reached their limits. Proposals were made for thicker armor, stronger engines, and more powerful guns, but Japan's wartime economy could no longer support such rapid retooling. Raw materials were scarce, factories were already stretched thin, and American bombers were beginning to hit the mainland. For the Allies, however, the lesson was clear. The M2 Browning wasn't just another machine gun. It was a battlefield equalizer. Commanders began mounting it on everything that could carry one: jeeps, trucks, landing craft, bombers, and tanks. Its deep, distinct rhythm became the background sound of the advancing American army. To the enemy, it was instantly recognizable, a sound that signaled power, precision, and inevitability. What made the weapon even more feared was its reach. While most infantry machine guns were effective up to a few hundred meters, the .50 caliber could hit targets well over 2 kilometers away. Against aircraft, it was deadly. Against infantry, it was overwhelming. And against light armor, it was devastating. Every encounter like Saipan reinforced that the United States had mastered not just mass production but also the art of designing weapons that were simple, adaptable, and brutally efficient. As American forces continued to advance across the Pacific, the legend of the Ma-Deuce grew. Pilots, sailors, and ground troops all swore by it. It was said that no matter where the fight was, in the air, at sea, or on land, somewhere nearby, the steady roar of a .50 caliber Browning was echoing. For the Japanese, that sound came to represent something far more than a weapon. It was the sound of an enemy that could not be stopped. After Saipan, the Browning M2.50 caliber was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol. Across the Pacific, soldiers began to speak of it with a mix of awe and affection. It had proven its worth not only against aircraft and infantry but even against enemy armor, and word of its reliability spread through every branch of the armed forces. When American troops moved from one island to the next, from Tinian to Peleliu to Iwo Jima, the familiar rhythm of the .50 echoed through every landing and every firefight. To the Marines, it was the reassuring voice of their advance. To the Japanese, it was the sound of approaching inevitability. The genius behind the M2 lay in its adaptability. John Browning had never imagined his creation would become such a universal tool of war, but the weapon's design made it nearly perfect for any role. Mounted on ships, it became an anti-aircraft gun, cutting through waves of enemy aircraft. Placed on bombers, it formed the defensive shield that protected crews over the skies of Europe and the Pacific. On jeeps and tanks, it became a mobile wall of fire that could repel ambushes and sweep open fields. Wherever it appeared, it reshaped the balance of combat. American aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the P-47 Thunderbolt carried multiple M2s. The B-17, in its final variants, was armed with up to 13 of them, creating a defensive sphere of fire that made it almost untouchable from certain angles. Pilots joke that flying near a B-17 felt like being surrounded by thunder, a storm of tracers flashing from every direction. The P-47, one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war, carried 8 M2s in its wings. Each burst could tear apart enemy aircraft or shred locomotives and convoys on the ground. When used in strafing runs, a single P-47 could disable an entire column of trucks or destroy bridges in seconds. On the ground, the same weapon earned a reputation for being indestructible. Soldiers said it never quit, no matter the conditions, sand, rain, salt, or mud. It could fire thousands of rounds before showing signs of wear. Crews learned to disassemble, clean, and reassemble it blindfolded, often in total darkness. And because its parts were interchangeable across all models, maintenance was simple. It was the kind of weapon soldiers trusted completely, a piece of machinery that felt alive, dependable, and loyal. The Japanese quickly learned to recognize the sound of the M2 from a distance. Its deep, heavy rhythm was distinct, slower than the chatter of lighter guns, but infinitely more intimidating. In jungles and on beaches, soldiers described feeling the vibrations in the ground before they even heard the shots. Many accounts mention how the first bursts would cause entire squads to scatter, seeking cover behind anything solid, though most cover offered little protection. The Hago tanks, once the pride of Japanese engineering, were now vulnerable not only to artillery or tanks but to machine guns mounted on jeeps. This psychological effect was enormous. The Japanese army, which had relied heavily on infantry assaults and light armor, found itself facing an enemy whose standard equipment outclassed its specialized designs. Even more concerning was America's industrial capacity. Every M2 destroyed in battle could be replaced within days. The United States produced the weapon on an industrial scale, and by 1945, hundreds of thousands were mounted across the world. No matter how far Japanese troops withdrew, the same weapon followed them. The difference in philosophy between Japan and the United States could not have been more striking. Japan valued mobility, craftsmanship, and precision, each tank and weapon designed for specific roles and conditions. America valued standardization, power, and versatility, a single weapon adaptable to any purpose. Where Japanese engineers refined, Americans multiplied. This approach turned weapons like the M2 into the backbone of a global arsenal, one that could be shipped anywhere and immediately make an impact. Back at the front, Marines quickly learned to use the M2 not only for direct combat but as a tool of dominance. Mounted on trucks, they formed mobile firebases that could move with advancing troops. On landing craft, they protected soldiers storming the beaches from enemy snipers and machine guns. On tanks, they gave commanders a weapon to counter ambushes and aerial threats. The sight of an American tank rolling forward with a .50 caliber on top became one of the most recognizable images of the war. And yet, for all its power, the M2 was not loved for its destructiveness alone. Soldiers respected it for its character, the sound, the rhythm, the feeling of control it gave. It was the soldier's companion, the weapon that never failed them. Pilots, sailors, and infantry all referred to it in personal terms, calling it Ma-Deuce, as if it were a friend rather than a machine. By the time the war began to turn decisively against Japan, the Browning .50 caliber had earned a mythic status. It wasn't just a product of engineering, it was a product of philosophy, the belief that strength and simplicity could achieve more than sophistication alone. Each battle reinforced this truth. Whether over the skies of Europe or on the beaches of the Pacific, the M2 didn't just participate in the war, it defined it. By late 1944, the M2 Browning had become as much a part of the American identity in war as the uniform itself. Every major unit, from the Army and Marines to the Navy and Air Force, relied on it in some form. Its sound could be heard on every front, from the jungles of New Guinea to the skies above the Philippines. The weapon's deep, rhythmic roar became a signal that the Americans were near. For many Japanese soldiers, that sound carried a single meaning. It was time to take cover, or it was already too late. As American forces advanced closer to Japan's home islands, battles grew fiercer and more desperate. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese troops dug into elaborate tunnel networks and caves, determined to make every inch of ground costly. For the Marines storming those positions, the M2 became more than just a gun, it was a lifeline. Its heavy rounds could penetrate wooden bunkers, shatter rock barriers, and silence defensive nests that lighter weapons couldn't touch. It offered something invaluable, the ability to suppress an enemy that refused to surrender. Gunners learned to use the .50 caliber in short, deliberate bursts to conserve ammunition and prevent overheating. The weapon's recoil was strong, but manageable, and its steady rhythm gave trained operators an almost musical control. Many veterans described firing it as both exhausting and exhilarating, the sense of power combined with precision. The gunner, positioned behind the large twin grips, felt the vibration run through their entire body. Each round fired carried enormous energy, capable of changing the course of a skirmish in seconds. On Okinawa, the M2 found yet another use, anti-air defense. Japanese aircraft, especially kamikaze planes, frequently attacked naval vessels and beachheads. The .50 caliber guns, often mounted in pairs or quads, became the first line of defense. Crews stationed on ships or landing barges used them to create walls of tracer fire, filling the sky with streaks of light. Pilots diving toward American ships often found themselves flying directly into a storm of red-hot metal. The gun's reliability and quick traverse made it the perfect choice for such high-pressure situations. As the war neared its end, the M2's versatility only grew. In Europe, it had already proven itself in tank battles, air combat, and infantry support. In the Pacific, it became the weapon of all environments, equally effective on beaches, mountains, and open water. And as the Allied forces closed in on Japan, one fact was undeniable. The M2 Browning had changed the way warfare was fought. The Japanese, facing an overwhelming enemy, could no longer rely on their earlier tactics. Light armor charges, once successful in China and Southeast Asia, were now hopeless against the combined firepower of the American arsenal. Even when Japan introduced newer models like the Type 3 Kaien-U or the improved Type 97 variants, they were produced in too few numbers and arrived too late. The M2 had helped create a new standard, one where speed and bravery could no longer compensate for industrial and technological inferiority. What made the situation even more striking was that the M2 itself was already decades old. Designed in the aftermath of World War I, it had outlasted almost every other machine gun of its generation. Where others required constant modernization, the M2 remained relevant with only minor adjustments. Its basic design, a balance of power, reliability, and simplicity, was so effective that no replacement ever truly surpassed it. Even as the world's armies experimented with lighter automatic weapons and advanced designs, They kept returning to the same solution, the timeless strength of Browning's creation. By 1945, as American forces prepared for the possible invasion of Japan, warehouses were filled with thousands of M2s ready to be mounted on any vehicle, boat, or aircraft. Every plan, from landings to bombing campaigns, included them. They were not just weapons, they were infrastructure. Entire strategies depended on their presence. When the war finally came to a close, the M2 didn't fade into history. It stayed, a constant, quietly humming reminder of the industrial might and ingenuity that had defined the Allied victory. Soldiers returning home spoke of it with respect, not fear. It wasn't glorified for destruction but admired for its dependability, the weapon that always did its job, no matter the conditions. As nations rebuilt, military theorists began to study what made certain technologies endure. The M2 became a perfect case study. It wasn't the fastest, nor the most advanced, but it was the most balanced. It could adapt. Whether mounted on a bomber in 1944 or a patrol vehicle decades later, it remained fundamentally the same, a century-old design still serving in the world's most advanced armies. Its legacy didn't end with the war. In fact, that was only the beginning. The post-war years would see the M2 evolve from a symbol of American might in World War II into a defining weapon of the modern era, from Korea to Vietnam and far beyond. When peace returned in 1945, the world expected the weapons of war to fade into museums and memories. But the M2 Browning wasn't finished. In fact, it was just getting started. As new conflicts emerged, the .50 caliber machine gun transitioned seamlessly from the battlefields of World War II to the icy mountains of Korea and the dense jungles of Vietnam. It was no longer just a tool of victory. It had become an essential part of American military identity. In the Korean War, the M2 once again proved that age was no obstacle to effectiveness. Mounted on tanks, jeeps, and even static positions, it became a crucial element of defense against waves of enemy assaults. The weapon's range and accuracy allowed it to strike targets across valleys and mountain ridges where smaller firearms couldn't reach. During night battles, the glow of tracer rounds illuminated the frozen landscape like streaks of lightning. Veterans recalled how the rhythmic pulse of the Browning often decided whether a position held or fell. It wasn't only the ground forces that depended on it. American aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre carried 6 M2s in their wings during air battles over Korea. Pilots described the effect as overwhelming. Each burst could shatter enemy aircraft before they even had time to maneuver. The combination of high speed and the tremendous impact of .50 caliber rounds made it one of the deadliest weapons of early jet warfare. By the time the Vietnam War began, the M2 had already earned a kind of mythic status. While the world was moving toward guided missiles and automatic rifles, the old Browning remained firmly in place, reliable, simple, and brutally effective. On patrol boats moving through narrow rivers, on armored vehicles rolling through the jungle, and on the perimeters of American bases, the M2's familiar thud echoed through the humid air. What made it so irreplaceable wasn't just its power, it was its dependability. The weapon was known to function in heat, cold, humidity, or sand. It required little maintenance beyond cleaning and could fire thousands of rounds before showing wear. Its simplicity was its genius. Soldiers joked that the M2 didn't care where it was or who used it. As long as you fed it ammunition, it would do its job. The Vietnam War also revealed a new dimension of the M2's flexibility. Mounted on helicopters like the UH-1 Huey, it provided aerial fire support for ground troops. The weapon that once defended bombers in World War II was now protecting soldiers from ambushes in dense forests. Its rounds could clear landing zones, break enemy positions, and protect supply convoys from sudden attacks. It was one of the few tools that seemed to bridge the gap between two completely different wars and still perform flawlessly. Soldiers began referring to the M2 as Old Reliable. Some of the guns in Vietnam had actually seen service in World War II, still operating decades later with minimal replacement parts. This gave them a near-legendary reputation, a symbol of American durability and design. New recruits were trained by veterans who spoke about the Browning with the same reverence earlier generations had for their rifles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was trusted, and that mattered far more. As technology advanced, militaries experimented with lighter and faster weapons, but none could truly replace the M2. Efforts were made to create a new heavy machine gun with modern features, but all fell short of the Browning's unique combination of simplicity, firepower, and reliability. By the 1970s, it was clear the M2 wasn't going anywhere. Its influence extended far beyond the battlefield. Engineers designing modern weapons often studied its mechanism, its short recoil operation, balanced components, and easy field maintenance. They realized that Browning's century-old design had achieved near perfection in its intended role. The M2 was not only a weapon but a benchmark of engineering philosophy, proof that the simplest solution, when done right, can endure longer than anyone expects. Through the decades, it became more than just military hardware. For many soldiers, it represented a constant presence in an unpredictable world. In conflicts filled with uncertainty, there was comfort in knowing that one thing never changed: the M2 would always work. It was a mechanical heartbeat of every American operation, from the frozen hills of Korea to the rivers of Vietnam. By the time the 1980s arrived, the M2 had already served longer than most soldiers who operated it had been alive. It was still being produced, still being mounted on tanks, aircraft, and ships, and still earning respect wherever it appeared. When military historians look back, they realize that few inventions had such a consistent record of success across so many wars, climates, and generations. As the Cold War deepened, nations across the globe built vast arsenals of new weapons, missiles, jet fighters, and computerized systems that seemed to redefine what modern warfare meant. Yet amid all this rapid innovation, the M2 Browning stood unchanged, like a monument to practical engineering. While other weapons came and went, the old .50 caliber machine gun kept serving, generation after generation, on vehicles, ships, aircraft, and guard towers around the world. By the 1990s, the M2 had been in continuous service for more than half a century, yet it was still one of the most widely used heavy machine guns on Earth. The reason was simple: it worked. It could be transported anywhere, mounted on anything, and fired in any condition. From the freezing cold of Alaska to the deserts of the Middle East, it functioned with the same steady rhythm it had shown in the jungles of the Pacific decades earlier. Mechanics often joked that as long as you could carry ammunition and a wrench, the M2 would outlast everything else on the battlefield. The gun did receive modern upgrades, but always with a light touch. The M2HB, or heavy barrel version, became the standard model, with reinforced components to withstand continuous firing. Later came the M2A1, fitted with a quick-change barrel system to make maintenance faster and safer. But even with these refinements, the heart of Browning's original 1930s design remained intact. It was as if the weapon had already reached the limit of practical perfection. During the Gulf War in 1991, the M2 once again proved its value. Mounted on Humvees, tanks, and helicopters, it was used in nearly every engagement. Its ability to reach long distances made it ideal for open desert combat. Pilots and soldiers described seeing its tracer rounds glowing through the sandstorms, bright lines cutting through the night sky like fire streaks. The weapon's reliability under the harsh desert conditions impressed even those who had doubted its old-fashioned look. The same story repeated in the wars of the 21st century. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the M2 remained one of the most trusted tools for both offense and defense. Mounted on armored vehicles and guard towers, it became a guardian weapon, the first to respond to ambushes or attacks on convoys. Troops often described its effect as immediate and decisive. Once the M2 opened fire, the fight usually ended quickly. It could reach across valleys, pierce walls, or stop approaching vehicles before they reached danger zones. There was also a psychological side to it. The M2's unique sound carried far, echoing across landscapes and signaling strength. Soldiers said that even when they weren't firing, just having the M2 mounted nearby gave them confidence. It represented safety, a reminder that no matter how unpredictable the situation, they had something that worked every time. What made the M2 so timeless wasn't only its mechanical durability but its adaptability to new technologies. Over the years, engineers developed advanced sighting systems, stabilization mounts, and remote control turrets, all designed to integrate seamlessly with the old gun. Modern versions could be aimed by computer, operated from inside armored vehicles, or linked to sensors that tracked movement automatically. And yet, beneath all the digital improvements, the core mechanism was still the same piece of metal John Browning had designed almost a century earlier. Even in an era of precision-guided weapons, drones, and laser targeting, the M2 remained relevant. Its raw simplicity gave it an advantage. It didn't depend on electronics or complex systems that could fail in the field. It was a weapon that relied on physics, not software, and that made it almost immune to technological obsolescence. In museums, visitors often see the M2 displayed beside tanks, planes, and vehicles at once armed. But for many soldiers, it's not an artifact, it's still part of daily life. The gun continues to guard bases, protect convoys, and patrol coastlines. It has been in service longer than any other firearm in US history, and astonishingly, it shows no sign of retirement. Military historians sometimes call it the century gun, not because it marks 100 years of service, but because it represents an entire century of warfare, technology, and adaptation. Every conflict since 1933 has felt its presence in some way. Its story is not just about one weapon, but about human ingenuity, the rare moment when design meets function so perfectly that time itself becomes irrelevant. By the dawn of the 21st century, the M2 Browning was no longer just a weapon, it had become a legend. To the men and women who served beside it, the heavy machine gun symbolized endurance, craftsmanship, and dependability. It was a living bridge between the soldiers of World War II and those fighting in modern conflicts nearly 100 years later. Few tools in human history had remained so unchanged, yet so effective. Every generation of American troops inherited the M2 like a family heirloom. They learned how to assemble it blindfolded, how to clear jams under stress, and how to manage its weight with precision. In training grounds across the world, instructors would point to the old machine gun and tell new recruits, "This is what reliability looks like." The gun wasn't sophisticated or elegant. It was raw and honest, the kind of weapon that demanded respect because it always delivered. The cultural influence of the M2 extended far beyond the battlefield. It became part of movies, documentaries, and video games, its deep, thunderous rhythm instantly recognizable to anyone who had ever seen footage of war. For many, the sound of the .50 caliber was the sound of power, not reckless destruction, but controlled dominance. It was the sound of a nation's industrial strength distilled into one mechanical heartbeat. The Browning's design philosophy began to be studied in engineering schools, not only as a military innovation but as an example of functional perfection. Students learn how simplicity could lead to longevity, how the balance between form and function could outlast even the most ambitious modern technologies. It became a metaphor for durable design, a reminder that sometimes the most lasting creations are those that do their job quietly and well. Among veterans, stories about the M2 took on an almost mythic tone. Marines who had used it in the Pacific passed their knowledge to those who carried it in Korea. Those veterans taught the next generation who brought it into Vietnam, who then handed the same wisdom to their children in Iraq and Afghanistan. The same weapon, the same feel, the same sound, connecting soldiers separated by decades and continents. It was a shared language of service. The weapon also came to embody a philosophy of balance in warfare. It wasn't the biggest gun, nor the most technologically advanced, but it was always effective. It didn't rely on complex electronics or fragile components. It thrived on simplicity and consistency. This balance between raw power and human control mirrored the very nature of the soldiers who used it, disciplined, focused, and enduring under pressure. When historians describe the industrial age of warfare, the M2 is always part of the conversation. It represents not just American engineering, but a shift in how wars were fought and sustained. The weapon reflected the broader truth that success in modern conflict depended on logistics, mass production, and reliability as much as courage and tactics. The M2 was proof that superior design could carry through multiple eras of warfare without ever needing reinvention. And yet, for all its mechanical perfection, the M2's legacy is deeply human. Its longevity speaks to the people who maintained it, operated it, and trusted it through chaos and uncertainty. Each gun bears the fingerprints of countless hands, soldiers who cleaned it in the rain, reloaded it under pressure, and relied on it when everything else seemed to falter. The weapon's story is as much about them as it is about the steel and springs that compose it. In military museums today, visitors often see M2s mounted on vehicles that tell stories from Saipan, Normandy, and Fallujah, three completely different worlds, connected by one machine. That continuity gives it a presence few other weapons possess. It's not just a relic, it's a reminder of how design, discipline, and determination can span generations. For the soldiers of today, the M2 isn't ancient history. It's still mounted on Humvees, aircraft, and naval vessels, still defending, still reliable, still relevant. When young service members see it for the first time, many are surprised to learn how old the design is. Yet when they pull the trigger and feel its steady rhythm, the question of age disappears. It doesn't feel old, it feels eternal. In the end, the story of the M2 Browning is not merely the story of a machine, it is the story of endurance. Across generations, it has remained a symbol of ingenuity, proof that greatness in design does not come from constant reinvention, but from understanding what works and perfecting it. The M2 was never about glamour or speed. It was about reliability, about creating something that would keep working when everything else failed. For nearly a century, it has done exactly that. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen have trusted it on every continent and in every climate imaginable. Through freezing storms and burning deserts, across mountain ranges and open seas, it has remained the same steadfast companion, simple, effective, and unyielding. While weapons around it have evolved into digital marvels of precision, the M2 stands as a bridge between eras, a piece of engineering that transcends the time it was made. In the quiet moments after battle, when the echoes fade and the smoke clears, there is something humbling about the sight of a weapon like the M2. It reminds us that the tools of war are ultimately shaped by human hands, by designers, builders, and operators who sought to create something dependable in a world of uncertainty. It also reminds us that technology, when done right, can outlive the very conflicts it was built for and become part of the shared story of humankind. The gun that once tore through the armor of Japanese tanks on Saipan now serves as a guardian on peacekeeping missions, mounted on vehicles protecting convoys and humanitarian operations around the globe. Its purpose has evolved, but its spirit remains the same: steadfast protection, precise control, and quiet reliability. The same qualities that once won wars now preserve peace. Even now, more than 100 years after John Browning first put his pencil to paper, militaries around the world still manufacture new versions of his design. They may have different barrels, improved mounts, or digital sights, but the heart of the weapon, the mechanism that cycles with that familiar rhythm, is still his. Few inventions can claim such longevity. Fewer still can claim to have shaped history as profoundly. Historians often say that the M2 is not just a weapon, but a lesson, a reminder that true progress doesn't always mean moving forward quickly. Sometimes it means refining what already works until it reaches a point where it can't be improved further. That is what Browning achieved. He didn't just build a gun. He built a legacy of precision and trust that outlasted empires, wars, and generations. When future engineers study the machines that define the 20th century, they will find the M2 among the locomotives, airplanes, and ships that changed the world. It will stand not because of its destructive power, but because of its endurance, because it represents a time when craftsmanship and purpose aligned so perfectly that the result became timeless. And somewhere, on a quiet outpost or a ship far from home, a soldier still checks the feed belt, chambers around, and feels the same familiar weight of the weapon that generations before him did. He doesn't think of it as a piece of history. He thinks of it as what it has always been: reliable, steady, ready. That is the true legacy of the M2 Browning. Not the sound of its fire, not the number of battles it has seen, but the simple fact that after 100 years, it still stands watch, the same unshakable guardian that once turned the tide of battle and taught the world a lesson it has never forgotten. That simplicity, when perfected, can outlast everything.